You have 30 days to get rid of every last one of them, or we will. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and toxic, delivered from a woman whose floral print moo-moo seemed to strain against the sheer force of her own self-importance. She stood on the edge of my property, right where the manicured HOA-approved sod met the slightly wilder grass of my 10 acres. A clipboard clutched to her chest like a ballistic shield. This was Karen, president of the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association, a title she wore with the gravity of a five-star general, though her theater of operations was limited to enforcing beige-only mailbox regulations and measuring lawn height with a terrifyingly precise ruler. Her gaze swept over my land, past the chicken coop where my hens were contentedly clucking, over to the small paddock where my daughter Emily was brushing her pony, Buttercup. The look on Karen's face wasn't just disapproval. It was a deep, instinctual revulsion, as if the very existence of a life not cataloged in her three-ring binder of bylaws was a personal affront. My hand, which had been resting on the porch railing, tightened, the wood grain pressing into my palm. I had faced down men with rifles in places I couldn't point to on a map for people back home, my heart beating a steady, trained rhythm. But the fury that spiked in my chest at that moment was a different kind of fire, hotter and more personal, because this wasn't a dusty street in a foreign country. This was my home, and that wasn't an enemy combatant. It was my 10-year-old daughter, whose face was crumpling with confusion and fear. I saw Emily's small hand freeze mid-stroke on Buttercup's flank, her head turning toward the sound of Karen's voice. That was it, the line. You don't threaten a man's family and you don't threaten his home. And for a veteran who spent 2 decades defending the idea of home, those two things were one and the same. Karen had just declared war. She just didn't know who she was fighting. If you've ever dealt with a nightmare HOA, a power-tripping board member who thinks they own your life because you share a zip code, then hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare story, because you are not alone, and you won't believe how this ends. This wasn't just about a few chickens and a pony. It was about a fundamental right to be left alone on your own property, a right I thought I had earned. After 20 years as a combat engineer, clearing paths and building fortifications under conditions most people only see in movies, I came home looking for the opposite of everything I'd known. I didn't want concrete and concertina wire. I wanted soil and split-rail fences. My wife Sarah and I poured our life savings and my VA loan into this place, a 10-acre island of old Florida, a remnant of a time before master-planned communities had devoured the landscape. It was a perfect rectangle of land with a small, sturdy farmhouse built in the 1940s, surrounded by ancient live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. The real selling point was that it was grandfathered in. The massive Oak Meadows development had sprung up around it in the late 90s, a sea of identical stucco houses. Our property was an exception, an anomaly, a fact that was clearly stated in our closing documents. We weren't members of the HOA, didn't have access to their community pool or tennis courts, and weren't subject to their covenants. Or so I had thought. For 5 years, it was paradise. I taught Emily how to garden, we built the chicken coop together, and for her 8th birthday, we got her Buttercup, a gentle Shetland pony with a mischievous streak. The goats Salt and Pepper came a year later, more for their brush clearing abilities than anything else. This was my decompression chamber, my slice of peace. The sounds of my little farm were the sounds of life, a world away from the whine of machinery and the crackle of a radio. But peace, I was quickly learning, is often just the lull between battles. Karen had been elected HOA president 6 months prior on a platform of restoring community values, which seemed to be code for harassing anyone whose life didn't fit her narrow, sterile vision of suburbia. She started with notes about my unsightly gravel driveway, then complaints about the crow of my rooster, which she claimed was a violation of noise ordinances that didn't even apply to my land. I had ignored them, filing them away in a folder labeled nuisance, assuming she'd eventually get tired. I had underestimated her ambition. This ultimatum was a full frontal assault. We, she had said, or we will. The implication was chilling. I could picture it already, a fleet of animal control vans, sheriff's deputies serving some bogus warrant she'd cooked up, my daughter's screams as they led her pony away. It was a vision straight out of a nightmare, and it was a strategic miscalculation on her part of epic proportions. She thought she was dealing with some pushover homeowner she could intimidate with a clipboard and a shrill voice. She had no idea she had just poked a man who professionally dismantled obstacles for a living. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the way my CO taught me to do before breaching a door. I looked from Karen's smug, expectant face to my daughter's worried one. "Emily," I called out, my voice steady, betraying none of the rage boiling beneath. "Take Buttercup back to the barn for a minute, sweetie. The grown-ups need to talk." Emily, bless her heart, obeyed without question, leading her pony away with a backward glance that said 1,000 things. Once she was out of earshot, I turned my full attention back to Karen. My face was a mask of calm, a technique honed over years of needing to project absolute control in moments of chaos. "Karen," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "you are trespassing on my property. You have 60 seconds to get back on the other side of that property line before I call the sheriff." Her jaw dropped, the clipboard dipping slightly. She was used to cowering, not commands. "This is an official HOA notification," she sputtered. "You can't—" 50 seconds, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. "And I would suggest you conduct any further official business through certified mail. This conversation is over." For a moment she stood her ground, her face turning a shade of purple that clashed horribly with her muumuu. Then, seeing the absolute lack of give in my eyes, she huffed, turned on her orthopedic heel, and stomped back toward the sidewalk, a tiny, furious storm cloud of indignation. I watched until she was gone. The first shot had been fired. Now it was time to build my fortress. The retreat back into the house was a tactical one. Emotion was a liability, a sentiment drilled into me from my earliest days in the service. Anger makes you sloppy. Panic gets you killed. In this new kind of war, sloppiness would mean losing my home, and panic would mean losing my family's peace. Sarah met me at the door, her face a canvas of concern. She had heard the exchange from the kitchen window. "What was that about, Jack? Who does she think she is?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I walked past her to the small office I'd set up in a spare room, the one overlooking the back pasture. "She thinks she's the law," I replied, pulling out the thick file folder from our home purchase. "I'm going to prove her wrong." This was my new mission, and every mission begins with reconnaissance. For the next hour, I didn't fume or rage. I organized. I sat at my desk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, and I reviewed every single page of our closing documents, our title insurance policy, and the property survey. The language was clear, almost poetic in its legalese. Said parcel is not subject to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Oak Meadows Homeowners Association. It was a bulwark, a legal wall I had trusted to protect us. But Karen's threat felt like she was bringing a trebuchet to knock it down. A wall is only as strong as the ground it's built on. I needed to go deeper. I needed to understand the bedrock. The next morning, I was up before the rooster even thought about crowing. I skipped my usual routine of feeding the animals, leaving it to Sarah and Emily, and instead put on a collared shirt and a pair of clean jeans. I looked like I was heading to a job interview, but my destination was far more important: the county records office. The building was a relic of 1970s civic architecture, a block of beige concrete that smelled faintly of stale coffee and decaying paper. But to me, it was an armory. I walked up to the clerk's counter, a wide expanse of faux wood laminate that had seen decades of property disputes, divorces, and dreams recorded and filed away. The clerk, a woman named Darlene with a magnificent beehive hairdo and glasses on a beaded chain, looked up at me with an expression of practiced neutrality. "How can I help you, hon?" she asked, her voice a low, gravelly hum. I explained my situation calmly and precisely. I gave her my parcel number and told her I needed to see the original plat maps for my land and the surrounding area, the oldest ones they had. I wasn't just looking for my own deed, I was looking for the history of the land itself. Darlene tapped a few keys on her ancient computer terminal, squinted at the green text, and then nodded slowly. "All right," she said, a flicker of interest in her eyes. "This is an old one. The digital records don't go back far enough. We'll have to go into the vault. She led me through a heavy door and into a climate-controlled room where history was stacked on rolling shelves. The air was cool and dry, and the smell of old paper and bookbinding glue was overwhelming. It was the scent of permanence, of things decided long before any of us were born. Darlene, with the practiced ease of a librarian of forgotten lore, spun a large wheel on one of the shelves, and a section of history rolled open. She ran her finger along a row of massive, leather-bound books. "Here we go," she murmured. "Plat maps, 1880 to 1900. She grunted as she and I together hauled a book the size of a car door onto a large viewing table. She opened it carefully, the thick, linen-backed pages crackling like autumn leaves. And there it was, under a beautifully scripted title reading Homestead Plats of Orange County, 1887, was a map of the area. It was a work of art, hand-drawn and color-washed by a surveyor, a century before the first meter was read for the Oak Meadow subdivision. And on that map, my 10-acre rectangle was clearly delineated, and inside its borders, in elegant cursive, were two words that made my heart hammer against my ribs: agricultural use. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a designation, a foundational truth of the property, recorded and sealed by the county more than 130 years ago. It predated the HOA. It predated the state's modern zoning laws. It was, in legal terms, the Genesis block. "Well, I'll be," Darlene whispered, peering over her glasses. "You've got yourself a genuine agricultural homestead plat. They can't touch that. State law protects these. Section 193.461 of the Florida statutes. Right to Farm Act. An HOA covenant can't supersede a state-protected agricultural classification that old." I felt a wave of cold, clean victory wash over me. This was it. This was the silver bullet. This was the legal high ground from which I would fight this war. I wasn't just a homeowner with a complaint. I was the steward of a historically zoned piece of agricultural land, and the state of Florida had my back. "Darlene," I said, my voice filled with a new kind of resolve, "I need 3 certified copies of this page, and I need a certified copy of the current county zoning map that shows my parcel's exemption. And I need a notarized affidavit from you stating that you assisted me in locating these documents in the official county archive." A slow smile spread across Darlene's face. She had seen this movie before. "Honey," she said, patting my arm, "you're going to need a bigger envelope." I walked out of that building an hour later with a thick manila envelope that felt heavier and more powerful than any weapon I had ever carried. Karen had brought a clipboard to a gunfight. I was bringing the entire legal history of the state of Florida. With my arsenal of certified documents, my next step was to follow the proper chain of command. A frontal assault was tempting, but a methodical, by-the-book approach would build an unassailable record of my reasonableness and Karen's intransigence. I spent the evening drafting a letter. It wasn't a plea, nor was it an angry screed. It was a formal, dispassionate notification. I structured it like an after-action report, clear, concise, and backed by evidence. I stated the facts. On this date, I was approached by the HOA president, Karen, and given a verbal ultimatum to remove my livestock. I then cited, with the precision of a legal scholar, the historical plat map of 1887 designating my property for agricultural use. I quoted the relevant Florida statute, the Right to Farm Act, and explained how it explicitly prevents nuisance lawsuits and restrictive covenants from infringing upon established agricultural operations. I attached pristine copies of the certified documents from the county records office, the 1887 map, the current zoning overlay showing my parcel as exempt, and Darlene's notarized affidavit. I concluded the letter by stating that, based on the incontrovertible evidence, my property was not subject to the HOA's restrictions regarding animals, and I considered the matter closed. I made 3 copies of the entire packet, one for my records, one to be hand-delivered to the official HOA management company, and one sent via certified mail, with return receipt requested directly to Karen's address. Let her sign for it. Let her hold the proof of her own overreach in her hands. The next day I drove to the soulless office park, where the HOA's management company, Prestige Community Management, resided. I walked in and handed the packet to the receptionist, a young woman who looked profoundly bored. I asked for a stamped and dated receipt confirming they had received the documents, a small but crucial step in the paper trail. She complied with a sigh, and I walked out feeling a sense of procedural satisfaction. The ball was in their court. I expected a grudging letter of acknowledgement, perhaps a quiet retraction. What I received a week later was a stark lesson in the psychology of a petty tyrant. It was an official-looking envelope from the HOA, and inside was not an apology, but a fine, a $500 fine. The violation was listed as failure to comply with community aesthetic standards, unauthorized livestock. It was as if my letter, my certified documents, my trip to the county vault had never happened. Tucked behind the fine was a short, unsigned note typed on HOA letterhead. It read, "The board has reviewed your correspondence and found it to be without merit. The community covenants apply to all properties within the visual radius of Oak Meadows to maintain property values. The 30-day compliance period is still in effect." It was breathtaking in its arrogance. Visual radius? That wasn't a legal term. It was something she had just invented, a desperate attempt to extend her little kingdom's borders by sheer force of will. She hadn't just ignored the evidence. She had declared it irrelevant. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of harassment. My calm resolve hardened into something colder, sharper. She wanted to play with paper. I would bury her in it. I immediately drafted a second letter, this one more pointed. I referenced my previous correspondence, including the tracking number for the certified mail she had signed for. I stated that the fine was illegitimate as the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property's agricultural activities, a fact they were now officially aware of. I formally disputed the fine and stated that any further attempts to fine or harass me on this matter would be considered willful and malicious, and I would seek legal remedy. I sent this letter again via certified mail. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived. This time, the fine was for $1,000. The violation was the same, but now it included a late fee and an administrative processing charge for the dispute I had filed. It also contained a new threat. If the amount was not paid within 15 days, a lien would be placed on my property. This was her weapon of choice, the lien, a bureaucratic garrote that could choke the life out of a property owner, clouding the title and making it impossible to sell or refinance. It was a threat designed to terrify the average person into submission. But I wasn't the average person. I knew that an illegitimate lien was a serious legal misstep on their part. Filing a fraudulent lien is a crime in many states, and at the very least it opened them up to a massive lawsuit. Karen, in her blind rage for control, was walking herself right into a kill box of my own design. The rumors started around the same time. I'd be out mending a fence and see neighbors from across the street whispering, their eyes darting toward my property. A woman I'd always shared a friendly wave with now hurried inside when she saw me. Karen was on the offensive, poisoning the well. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine, a friendly mailman who had seen his share of HOA drama, that at the last board meeting, Karen had spent 20 minutes talking about the stench from my property, the risk of disease from the animals, and the constant grating noise that was supposedly destroying the neighborhood's tranquility and driving down property values. It was a master class in propaganda. My 2 small goats, dozen chickens, and 1 pony were being painted as a biohazard and a public nuisance. The irony was that Karen's own house, 2 streets over, had a massive over-chlorinated pool whose chemical smell was so strong you could taste it from half a block away. And her 2 yapping poodles had more complaints against them on the community forum than my rooster ever did. Her hypocrisy was as vast and unsubtle as her collection of polyester caftans. She wasn't just trying to find me, she was trying to isolate me. She was turning my dream home into a pariah's island. And that was a mistake, because it forced me to go on the offensive myself. It was time to find some allies. My counter-offensive began not with lawyers or letters, but with coffee and conversation. Karen's strategy was to isolate me, to paint me as an outsider, a problem to be solved. My strategy had to be the opposite, to embed myself in the community, to show them I was a neighbor, not a nuisance, and to expose Karen as the true source of the neighborhood's discord. I started with the people on the periphery, the ones who lived just outside the HOA's main cluster, but were still in Karen's visual radius. I loaded up a wheelbarrow with dozens of fresh eggs from my hens, their shells in shades of brown, green, and blue. I attached a small, neatly printed card to each carton that read, "A gift from your neighbors, the Miller family," along with our address and phone number. Then, with Emily at my side, my secret weapon of wholesomeness, I went door to door. My first stop was the house directly across the street, a young couple with a toddler. They looked nervous when they opened the door, clearly having been primed with Karen's propaganda. "Hi," I said with a warm smile, holding out a carton of eggs. "I'm Jack Miller from across the way. We haven't had a chance to properly meet. My daughter Emily and I just wanted to drop these off for you." The wife, Jessica, glanced nervously back into her house before accepting the carton. "Oh," she said, "thank you. We heard you had chickens." "We do," I said cheerfully. "Emily here is the head chicken wrangler. We also have a couple of goats that keep the brush down. They're very friendly if your little one ever wants to come say hi." Emily, on cue, gave a shy wave. The toddler, who had been hiding behind his mother's legs, peeked out, his eyes wide with interest. "Goats?" he whispered. The tension in Jessica's shoulders eased a fraction. "That's nice of you," she said. "Karen from the HOA," she said. She trailed off, embarrassed. "Whatever Karen said," I interjected gently, "I can promise you it was probably an exaggeration. We love our little farm and we do our best to be good neighbors. If you ever have any issue at all, a noise, a smell, anything, please just call me directly. Here's my number." I handed her one of the cards. "Don't go through the HOA. Just talk to me. We're neighbors." This was the key. I was bypassing Karen's bureaucratic fortress and establishing direct lines of communication. I was replacing her narrative of the problem homeowner with the reality of the friendly guy with the fresh eggs. I repeated this process a dozen times, working my way through the surrounding streets. The reactions varied. Some were guarded, others were surprisingly warm. But in almost every interaction, I could see the seeds of doubt about Karen's narrative being planted. The real breakthrough, however, came from an unexpected source. 3 doors down from me lived a man named Arthur Henderson. He was in his late 70s, a retired history teacher who had lived in his house since it was built in the early 2000s, long before Karen's reign of terror. His lawn was immaculate, his roses were prize-winning, and he was known for his quiet, observant nature. I saw him watching me from his porch as I made my rounds. After I finished, he ambled over, leaning on a polished oak cane. "Jack Miller," he said, his voice a dry, academic rasp. "I'm Arthur Henderson. I've been meaning to talk to you." "Mr. Henderson," I said, shaking his hand, "it's a pleasure. I saw the HOA president making a scene on your lawn the other week," he said, getting straight to the point. "And I've been hearing the whispers at the clubhouse about your illegal farm." He gestured with his cane toward my property. "That land has had animals on it in some form or another for as long as I can remember. Old Man Hemlock had cattle on it back before this whole subdivision was even a blueprint. What she's doing is a historical absurdity." This was gold, a living witness to the land's history. "She's fining me, Mr. Henderson, threatening a lien." Arthur nodded slowly, a grim smile playing on his lips. "That's her move. It's what she does. Did you know she tried to make me rip out my wife's memorial rose garden? Claimed 3 of the bushes were a non-approved shade of red. Cost me $2,000 in legal fees to make her back down." My eyes widened. "You're kidding." "I am not," he said, his eyes hardening. "And I'm not the only one. There's the Garcias, who she fined into bankruptcy over the color of their kid's playset. The Wilsons, who she forced to resod their entire lawn because she didn't like the species of grass, even though it was the original sod from the builder. She's a predator who feeds on compliance. The moment someone stands up to her, she tries to crush them, to make an example of them." He looked me square in the eye. "She's picked the wrong person this time, hasn't she, son?" "I believe so," I said, a sense of alliance forming between us. "I have the original agricultural plat from 1887. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. A genuine, delighted laugh escaped him. "Oh, that's beautiful. That is poetically, historically beautiful. You've got her. You've got her dead to rights. He leaned in closer. But having the law on your side isn't enough with a woman like that. You need a public reckoning. I have records, you know. I kept copies of every nasty letter she sent me. Every threat. I know for a fact the Garcias kept theirs too. Her abuse has a pattern, a paper trail. A plan began to form in my mind, sharp and clear. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was Arthur's fight. It was the Garcias' fight. It was the fight of everyone who had been bullied into submission by a woman with a clipboard and a bottomless appetite for power. Karen thought she was isolating me. In reality, she was creating the very coalition that would bring her down. My mission had a new objective, not just to defend my property, but to liberate the entire neighborhood. The conversation with Arthur Henderson was the catalyst. It shifted my strategy from defense to a coordinated counterattack. The first step was to formalize my legal position. While I was confident in my research, navigating the specifics of property law and civil harassment required an expert. I called in a heavy hitter, Marcus Thorne, a man I had served with in the Corps. He had been a JAG officer, sharp as a tack and utterly fearless in a courtroom. After leaving the service, he'd started a private practice specializing in property and constitutional law. When I explained the situation over the phone, I could almost hear him grinning. "Jackie boy," he said, his voice booming with enthusiasm, "you've stumbled into the perfect legal storm. An overreaching HOA, a pre-existing land use right, a clear pattern of harassment. This is the kind of case I dream about. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. I'm in. Pro bono." Marcus flew down 2 days later. We sat at my kitchen table, which was now covered in documents. My certified maps, Karen's violation notices, Arthur's file of threatening letters, and the HOA's own book of covenants and restrictions. Marcus, in a crisp suit that looked out of place in my rustic kitchen, examined each document with the intensity of a bomb technician defusing a device. "Okay," he said after 2 hours of silent reading. "Here's the strategy. It's a classic rope-a-dope. We let her swing until she exhausts herself and makes a fatal mistake. We don't sue yet. We don't go to the press yet. We build an unimpeachable case file. Every fine she sends you, we respond to. Every letter we answer. We will be the most reasonable, legally grounded, and thoroughly documented victim of harassment this state has ever seen." He pointed to the pile of fines. "These are gold, Jack. Every single one she sends you after we've put her on notice with the 1887 plat is another nail in her coffin. It proves willful intent. She can no longer claim ignorance. She is knowingly using the HOA's power to harass you based on a jurisdiction she knows she doesn't have." His plan was meticulous. First, he drafted a formal response to the $1,000 fine and the lien threat. It was a masterpiece of legal prose, polite on the surface but with the lethality of a sniper's bullet. It reiterated my legal position, cited the relevant state statutes in excruciating detail, and then turned the tables. It stated that the HOA was now on notice and that any attempt to file a lien against my property would be considered frivolous, malicious, and tortious interference with property rights, and would be met with immediate legal action, seeking not only the removal of the lien, but also significant punitive damages. "This letter," Marcus explained, "is the legal trap. If she's smart, she'll show it to a real lawyer who will tell her to back off immediately. But a narcissist like her won't. Her ego won't let her. She'll double down, and when she does, she's ours." The second part of the plan was surveillance. "She's trespassing to take pictures for her violations?" Marcus asked. I confirmed she often stood just on the edge of my property line. "Perfect. We're getting cameras. High definition, time-stamped, audio-enabled. We'll position one on the porch aimed at the front of the property line and another on the barn aimed toward the side. Every time she comes onto your land, every time she screams at you, every time she peers through your fence, we'll have it recorded. We're creating a visual log of her obsession." That weekend, I installed a state-of-the-art security system. The cameras were discreet but powerful, their unblinking lenses covering every approach to the house and pasture. The third phase of the plan was community intelligence. On Marcus's advice, I, along with Arthur, began discreetly reaching out to other residents who had been targeted by Karen. We didn't frame it as a crusade. We framed it as a fact-finding mission. "We're putting together a record of interactions with the HOA board," Arthur would say to a neighbor at the mailbox, "just to ensure transparency. Have you ever received a violation notice you felt was unfair?" The stories poured in. The Garcias, as Arthur had mentioned, had indeed been fined repeatedly for the color of a swing set until they finally took it down, unable to afford a fight. A single mother was being hounded for having a small vegetable garden in her backyard, which Karen deemed agricultural and therefore commercial. A young military family on a tight budget was fined because their grass was a quarter of an inch too high the day after a tropical storm when it was too saturated to mow. We collected copies of their letters, their fines, their desperate emails. Each one was a piece of the mosaic, showing a clear pattern of abuse, targeting not real problems, but people Karen perceived as weak, different, or defiant. We were no longer just fighting for my farm. We were building a class action case in the court of public opinion, and soon in a court of law. A week after Marcus sent his letter, the trap was sprung. A new envelope arrived. It wasn't a fine. It was a formal notification from the management company that the HOA board had voted to proceed with placing a lien on my property for the now delinquent amount of $1,500. They had attached a copy of the draft lien document they intended to file with the county. Karen had taken the bait. She had put her name as president of the HOA on a document that was legally fraudulent. Marcus was ecstatic when I called him. "She did it," he said, laughing. "The fool actually did it. She signed her own death warrant. Don't do anything yet. Let them file it. The moment that lien is officially recorded with the county clerk, we move." The waiting was the hardest part. It felt like sitting in a blind, watching the target walk slowly into the crosshairs, knowing you had to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. The neighborhood was a tinderbox of tension, and Karen, oblivious to the legal pit she had just dug for herself, decided to light the match. The notice arrived a week later, pinned to the community bulletin board at the entrance to the subdivision. Emergency HOA meeting, addressing willful non-compliance and protecting our community's integrity. It was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. The agenda listed only one item: discussion and vote on further actions regarding the property at 1512 Old Grove Lane. My address. This was it. Karen wasn't content with liens and letters. She needed a public spectacle. She wanted to drag me before the entire community and brand me as a pariah, to use the force of social pressure to break me where fines had failed. She envisioned a public shaming, a modern-day trial where she would be both prosecutor and judge, and my neighbors the jury she had already poisoned. When I showed the notice to Arthur, he chuckled grimly. "The Roman Colosseum. She wants to throw you to the lions." "Good," I said, a cold resolve settling over me. "Lions are predictable." Marcus was thrilled. "This is better than I could have hoped for," he said over the phone. "A public meeting," she called herself. "It's the perfect venue. We're not just going to defend you, Jack. We're going to prosecute her." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. This was no longer just about my farm. It was about dismantling Karen's entire regime of terror. We weren't just bringing documents. We were bringing an army. I called Jessica, the young mother from across the street. I explained what was happening and asked if she would be willing to simply attend. "You don't have to say a word," I told her, "but your presence as my direct neighbor will speak volumes." She agreed, her voice firm. Arthur, meanwhile, had activated his network. He spoke to the Garcias, the Wilsons, and the single mother with the forbidden vegetable garden. He didn't ask them to fight. He simply invited them to a meeting where, for the first time, their grievances might be heard in a context larger than their own isolated struggle. On Thursday evening, we assembled. I put on the same collared shirt and clean jeans I'd worn to the records office. It felt like my uniform now. Marcus arrived in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to hum with latent energy. Arthur wore a tweed jacket, looking every bit the retired professor about to deliver a lecture on the fall of tyrants. We walked into the clubhouse together. The room was packed, Far more so than a typical HOA meeting, the air was thick with anticipation and animosity. Karen and the two other board members, a pair of sycophants named Barry and Linda, sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking smug and powerful. Karen, dressed in a vibrant purple pantsuit, beamed at the crowd, believing this large turnout was a sign of her popular support. She saw a mob ready for a witch hunt. She didn't see the quiet, determined faces of her victims scattered throughout the room. The meeting began with Karen tapping a gavel on the table. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It is a sad day when we must gather to address a neighbor who so flagrantly disrespects the rules that keep our community beautiful and our property values high." She then launched into a 15-minute monologue, a carefully constructed narrative of my supposed transgressions. She spoke of the unbearable stench, the cacophony of animal noises at all hours, and my arrogant refusal to comply with the generous and patient requests of the board. She painted me as an unreasonable outsider who was single-handedly dragging their pristine suburb back to the dark ages. All the while I sat in the front row, my face impassive, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let her speak. I let her spin her tale. I let her dig her own grave deeper with every lie. When she finally finished, she gestured toward me with a flourish. "The board now opens the floor to Mr. Miller, though after months of refusal to cooperate, I'm not sure what he could possibly have to say that would change things." "Thank you, Karen," I said, standing up. My voice was calm and carried easily through the silent room. "I do have a few things to say, and to show." Marcus stood with me and walked to the side of the room, where he calmly unpacked a portable projector and a small screen. A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face tightened. This was not part of her script. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "This is an HOA meeting, not a movie night." "It's an evidentiary presentation, Madam President," Marcus said smoothly, his voice courteous but firm. "My client is entitled to present his defense. I'm sure you want to ensure this meeting is conducted fairly." Boxed in by her own supposed commitment to procedure, Karen could only sit and fume. I walked to the front of the room, took a remote from Marcus, and clicked the first slide. The room went dark, and a high-resolution image of the 1887 Homestead Plat map filled the screen. The elegant cursive, agricultural use, was magnified for all to see. "This far," I began, my voice steady, "is the foundational legal document for my property, recorded in 1887. It designates my land for agricultural use. This designation predates this HOA by more than a century." I clicked to the next slide, which showed the relevant section of the Florida Right to Farm Act. I read the key passage aloud. "No farm operation which has been in operation for 1 year or more, and which was not a nuisance at the time it began, shall be a public or private nuisance." I clicked again. A copy of the certified letter I sent to the board, with the USPS tracking information showing it was received and signed for. On this date, I provided the board with all of this information. Your own rules require you to investigate disputes. Instead, you sent this. The next slide was the first $500 fine. And when I disputed that fine, citing the law, you sent this. The next slide, the $1,000 fine. And when my legal counsel warned you, in writing, against filing an illegal lien, you did this. The next slide was the lien document itself, bearing Karen's signature, magnified 10 times its normal size. A gasp went through the room. "This isn't about property values," I said, turning to face the crowd. "This is about a pattern of targeted harassment by a board president who ignores facts, dismisses the law, and uses her position to bully residents. And I am not the only one." That was the signal. Arthur Henderson stood up slowly from his seat in the third row. "My name is Arthur Henderson," he said, his voice resonating with the authority of a respected elder. 3 years ago, President Karen tried to force me to destroy a rose garden I planted in memory of my late wife. She fined me thousands of dollars, claiming the color of the roses violated the bylaws. He held up a thick folder. "I have the records right here." Then a woman in the back stood up. "I'm Maria Garcia," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "She fined us until we couldn't afford to fight anymore over the color of our children's swing set. We had to take it down. My kids cried for a week. One by one they stood. The single mother with the vegetable garden, the military family, a dozen people, a dozen stories, all echoing the same theme of arbitrary cruelty and abuse of power. What Karen had intended as my public execution had become her own. The room was no longer a mob, it was a tribunal. The camera I had seen on a local news reporter's shoulder, who must have been tipped off by Marcus, was now focused squarely on Karen's face, which had collapsed from smug certainty into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The aftermath of the meeting was like a dam breaking. The carefully constructed facade of Karen's authority crumbled overnight. The video of the meeting, particularly the segment where resident after resident stood up to share their stories of her bullying, went viral within the community. The local news station that had sent a reporter ran a short but devastating segment on the 11 o'clock news, framing it as a David versus Goliath story of an HOA president's reign of terror being challenged by a veteran and his neighbors. The public exposure was a torch thrown into the dry kindling of a decade of resentment. The next morning, the phones at Prestige Community Management began ringing off the hook. Homeowners, now emboldened and united, were demanding answers. They wanted to know why the board, under Karen's leadership, had been allowed to operate with no oversight. They demanded to know why the management company had enabled her harassment by sending out the fines and lien notices, even after being presented with my legal documentation. The pressure was immense. More importantly, Arthur Henderson, Maria Garcia, and I, with Marcus's guidance, drafted a formal petition, citing the HOA's own bylaws, which allowed for a special meeting to be called and a vote of no confidence to be held if 25% of homeowners signed on. We began collecting signatures. It took less than 48 hours to get more than double the required number. Every person who had been fined, threatened, or even just made to feel small by Karen eagerly signed their name. We were no longer a scattered group of victims. We were an organized, unified block of homeowners demanding change. Simultaneous to this grassroots movement, Marcus launched the legal broadside. He filed a lawsuit on my behalf in county court. It was not a small claims action. It was a full-blown civil suit against the Oak Meadows HOA and Karen personally. The suit had several counts: tortious interference with property rights for the fraudulent lien, a request for a declaratory judgment to affirm my property's exemption from the HOA covenants, and a claim for damages due to harassment and emotional distress. The centerpiece of the lawsuit was a request for a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the entire duration of Karen's presidency. In the complaint, Marcus masterfully wove together my story with the dozens of others we had collected, arguing that this was not an isolated dispute, but a consistent and malicious pattern of racketeering and abuse of power, using the HOA's financial mechanisms as a weapon against residents. The word racketeering was a calculated choice, and it sent shockwaves through the community. The lawsuit was served to Karen at her home by a professional process server. I heard from the mailman that she practically ripped the documents from his hand and slammed the door in his face. The management company was served at their office. Their reaction was far more pragmatic. Within a day, I received a call from a senior partner at Prestige Community Management. His tone was a complete reversal from the dismissive arrogance of their previous communications. He was panicked. "Mr. Miller," he began, "I want to personally apologize for the mishandling of your case. There has been a serious breakdown in procedure. We are launching a full internal investigation." "Your investigation is a little late," I replied coldly. "You had the facts weeks ago and chose to proceed with the harassment. You are co-defendants in my lawsuit." The silence on the other end of the line was thick with the sound of his career flashing before his eyes. "We are prepared to immediately recommend the board rescind all fines and withdraw the lien," he offered desperately. "That's a start," I said, "but it doesn't end there. My lawsuit stands, and the audit will proceed. The residents of this community deserve to know how their money has been spent." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Marcus made a call to an old contact at the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the state body that oversees the Right to Farm Act. He forwarded them my entire case file: the 1887 plat, the harassment letters, the lien. The state's interest was piqued, An HOA attempting to illegally override a state-protected agricultural designation was a serious matter. They sent Karen and the HOA a formal letter of inquiry, notifying them that they were under investigation for violating state law. Karen was now fighting a war on three fronts: a legal battle with me, a rebellion from her own residents, and an investigation by a state agency. Her little empire of beige mailboxes and lawn height regulations was collapsing around her, and it was all because she couldn't stand the sight of a little girl and her pony. The community, which she had tried to weaponize against me, had become my greatest asset. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami. Karen's downfall was as swift as it was spectacular, a textbook case of a tyrant being devoured by the very systems she had tried to manipulate. The forensic audit, which the court approved in an expedited hearing, thanks to the mountain of evidence Marcus presented, became the nail in her coffin. The auditors, a no-nonsense team of certified public accountants, descended on the HOA's records. What they found was not just sloppy bookkeeping, but a deliberate and systematic plundering of the community's funds. The audit revealed that Karen had been using the HOA's debit card for personal expenses, disguising them as community enhancement or office supplies. Hundreds of dollars on lavish dinners were labeled board meetings. A subscription to a high-end fashion magazine was filed under landscaping research. Most damningly, the audit uncovered a slush fund of sorts. Fines collected from residents like the Garcias were not always being deposited into the main HOA account. Some were being funneled into a separate, unaudited beautification committee account, which Karen controlled exclusively. From this account, she had paid a contractor, who turned out to be her brother-in-law, an exorbitant amount of money to install ornate, non-compliant gas lamps in front of her own house, and the houses of her two board allies, Barry and Linda. She had literally been using the fines she extorted from her victims to fund personal home improvements for herself and her cronies. The audit also confirmed what Arthur Henderson had long suspected: a pattern of selective enforcement. While she was fining people for the color of their play sets, her friends were getting away with major violations, like unapproved roof replacements and fence installations. Their fines were mysteriously waived in the system, with no record of an official board vote. When the audit report was finalized, Marcus made sure every single homeowner in Oak Meadows received a copy. The rage was palpable. The money she had taken from the Garcias for their swing set had paid for her gas lamps. The fine the single mother paid for her vegetable garden had subsidized Karen's dinner parties. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. The special meeting for the vote of no confidence was a formality. The clubhouse was overflowing, but this time, the mood wasn't tense. It was resolute. Karen, looking pale and deflated, sat at the front table, no longer the imperious queen but a defendant at her own sentencing. She didn't even try to speak. Arthur Henderson stood and read a summary of the audit's findings. With each revelation, a low growl of anger rippled through the crowd. When the time came to vote, it was nearly unanimous. Karen, Barry, and Linda were removed from the board in disgrace. In a final desperate act of spite, Karen made one last, foolish move. The day after she was voted out, she called the county's animal control services and filed an anonymous, detailed complaint against me for animal cruelty and neglect. She claimed my animals were starving, living in filth, and a danger to the public. It was her last, pathetic attempt to hurt me. An hour later, an animal control truck pulled up my driveway. A weary-looking officer named Dave got out, an apologetic look already on his face. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. "We got a call. Have to check it out." "Of course," I said calmly. "Please come on back. Let me give you the tour." I led him to the chicken coop, which was clean and filled with fresh straw, the hens clucking contentedly with access to food and fresh water. I took him to the goat pen, where Salt and Pepper trotted up to him, nudging his hand for a scratch. Their coats were brushed, their hooves were trimmed, and they were the picture of health. Finally, I led him to the paddock where Emily was giving Buttercup her afternoon apple. The pony's stall was immaculate. "Looks like a pretty serious case of neglect," Dave said, his voice thick with sarcasm. He knelt down and let Buttercup nuzzle his face. "This animal is clearly miserable." He stood up and shook his head. "We get these calls sometimes, spite calls, usually after an HOA dispute." He pulled out his notepad. The complaint was very specific, which usually means it's from someone with a personal grudge. For my report, I have to note that I found the animals to be in excellent health, with clean living conditions and ample food and water. I also have to note that the complaint appears to be completely unfounded. He paused, then looked at me. Filing a false report with animal control is a misdemeanor, you know. If we can trace the call. I think I have a pretty good idea who it was, I said. But honestly, it's not worth it. She's already beaten. The officer nodded, tipped his hat to Emily, and left. Karen's final desperate missile had been a dud. It didn't cause me pain. It just created one more official document, an animal control report, testifying to the excellent care of my animals. Another piece of paper to add to my fortress of facts. Her war was over, and she had lost on every single front. The final section of this story is one of quiet restoration. With Karen and her cronies gone, the community held a new election. Arthur Henderson, to no one's surprise, was elected the new HOA president. His first official act was to call a board meeting where they voted unanimously on 3 resolutions. The first was to formally withdraw the lawsuit-triggering lien and expunge every fine ever levied against me from the record. The second was to issue a formal, written apology to me and every other family named in our collection of grievances, acknowledging the board's past abuses of power. The third and most significant was to work with Marcus, who they hired as the HOA's new official counsel, to completely redraft the community's bylaws. The new bylaws were a model of clarity and reason. They included a clause explicitly recognizing and respecting all pre-existing property rights and zoning designations, specifically mentioning my parcel. They created a clear, fair, and transparent process for disputes, with an independent arbitration committee made up of residents. They stripped away the petty, arbitrary rules about things like the shade of red on a rose bush and focused on what mattered: safety, structural integrity, and genuine public nuisances. The slush fund was dissolved, and the money was returned to the HOA's general fund. The board even passed a resolution to use some of that money to reimburse the Garcias for their playset and to help pay the legal fees Arthur had incurred fighting for his wife's memorial garden. Justice, it turned out, could be retroactive. The lawsuit I had filed was settled quickly. The HOA's insurance company, facing the mountain of evidence in the damning audit, was eager to avoid a public trial. They agreed to a settlement that covered all of Marcus's fees, a modest sum for my family's emotional distress, and most importantly, a legally binding consent decree that enshrined the new, fairer bylaws into a court order, making it nearly impossible for a future board to revert to the old ways. As for Karen, her humiliation was total. Faced with potential civil charges from the homeowners for the misappropriated funds, she and her husband sold their house in a hurry, at a loss, and moved out of the state. Her reign, which had felt so absolute and terrifying, simply evaporated, leaving behind only a cautionary tale and a set of fraudulent gas lamps that the new board promptly had removed. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. The cloud of fear and suspicion was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. People started talking to each other again. My little farm, once the source of so much controversy, became a beloved neighborhood landmark. Jessica from across the street now brought her toddler over every Saturday morning to feed the goats. Other kids would come by after school to see Buttercup. We hosted a fall festival in my pasture, with pony rides for the kids and fresh eggs and vegetables from my garden for the parents. Arthur Henderson gave a speech, not as the HOA president, but as a neighbor talking about the importance of community, respect, and standing up to bullies no matter how small their kingdom. Standing by the fence that day, watching Emily lead a line of giggling children on pony rides, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than the one I had before this all started. The battle had been ugly, but the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to Arthur, to the Garcias, to every resident who had found their voice. We hadn't just defeated a petty tyrant. We had reclaimed our community. We had torn down the invisible walls of fear and replaced them with the open gates of friendship and mutual respect. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the pasture, I stood on my porch with Sarah. Emily was in the paddock, giving Buttercup one last brush for the night. The sounds were the same as they had always been. the gentle clucking of the chickens heading into their coop, the soft nicker of the pony, the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. But they sounded different now. They were no longer sounds of defiance. They were the sounds of home. A home that we had fought for, a home that we had secured, not with walls of concrete, but with the stronger bonds of law, justice, and a community that had remembered how to stand together. The war was over, peace had been restored, and this time it felt permanent.